This is Story Loom, a podcast that threads stories of culture and well-being. I'm your host, Mariam Vahradyan, a psychologist, writer, and researcher. I'll be exploring how ancient cultural traditions help our local and diaspora communities heal, connect, and thrive. In each episode, I'll talk to creatives and entrepreneurs who keep tradition alive while adding their own unique touch. Join me in exploring how art and culture help us make meaning, develop resilience, and strengthen community bonds. This is Story Loom. Our guest on today's episode is Nyree Abrahamian, co-founder of the Tumanyan International Storytelling Festival and co-host of the award-winning podcast Country of Dust. Together, we'll be exploring the versatility of storytelling and how it builds connection, processes collective pain, and cultivates joy. Nyree also gives us a sneak peek into Season 2 of Country of Dust and reflects on the ways she's keeping storytelling dynamic and relevant in a changing Armenia. Before we dive into our conversation, I want to bring in a story by the festival's namesake, Hovhannes Tumanyan. He's widely considered Armenia's most beloved storyteller for capturing humor, contradiction, and heart. Let's take a listen. That was an excerpt from Kikos' Death, a classic folktale by Tumanyan about a family who mourns the imagined death of a boy who hasn't even been born yet. It's pretty absurd, hilarious, and honestly, relatable. We've all catastrophized about things that never even ended up happening. Some say Tumanyan captures the Armenian tendency to ruminate, or maybe it's just our shared human experience of worrying for no reason at all. Whatever it is, these are just some of the larger themes that the festival aims to understand. Today we're here with Nyree Abrahamian. Hi Nyree, I'm so excited to be talking to you today. We're going to be chatting with Nyree about the Tumanyan International Storytelling Festival, the podcast Country of Dust. We're going to dive into the importance of storytelling and narrative in the Armenian culture, and the work that Nyree is doing to keep promoting storytelling in a way that's modern and relevant and dynamic to today's changing Armenia. Nyree, welcome. Really looking forward to our conversation on Story Loom today. How are you doing? How's it going over in Yerevan today?
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you so much for having me. It's a sunny morning in Yerevan. I'm doing well.
Amazing. So I think we're actually going to dive straight into the Tumanyan International Storytelling Festival, which I unfortunately have not attended myself, but I've heard so much about it and read a lot about it. So Nyree, you co-founded a festival, which is a 3-day celebration of the narrative arts, and it takes place in Armenia's Lori region. So I'm curious, what inspired the creation of this festival? How did you and other people get involved with it? And how did you name it and pick Hovhannes Tumanyan?
Yeah, the origin story of the festival is it's not necessarily chronological. It's not like this happened and then that's why we did this. I think it was the convergence of a lot of forces at once. So firstly, it was the moment we were living through in Armenia. The first edition of the festival was in 2022. And was it 2022? Yes. And we were still very much living in the aftermath of the 2020 Artsakh war. There was still so much that was uncertain here in Armenia and in Artsakh, and it was a moment of a lot of change and just dynamic things happening around us. And I and my co-founders and the people around us just felt this need to process, reflect, and there were so many just vital stories unfolding all around us. And there was just this impulse to bring them together, to bring them in conversation with each other. So that was one big piece of it. And why Tumanyan? So it takes place in the town of Tumanyan in Lori. And so Hovhannes Tumanyan, the preeminent Armenian storyteller and humanist, was born in Dser, just very close to the town of Tumanyan. So it was named after him, and it's in the same region. Which, if anyone has been to Lori, it's the Debed Canyon. It's just this stunning landscape that you can see why when you're there, you can feel why it inspired so many of his stories. It's not just like the setting and a backdrop. It's a character. um, there's just so much richness there, both naturally and culturally. And so the town of Tumanyan is where the Tumanyan Development Foundation, which has been around for about 5 years, had several ongoing projects that had to do with developing the region economically and in terms of tourism, socially, culturally. And so a few of us got together and were thinking about um, like some kind of event that could take place in this beautiful setting. Um, and storytelling just seemed like the perfect fit, one, because of who the town is named after. But also what I was mentioning before, it was this moment where we really felt the need for this kind of reflecting on existing narratives and creating new narratives and building community around that. And so, yeah, it came together like that.
That sounds so exciting and really meaningful because I think, at a time where, you brought up that word narrative. I think narratives have always been and continue to be obviously really crucial. But at this pivotal time, it feels like it's especially vital to figure out what stories do we want to keep telling as a collective. And like, why do we want to keep telling them? So I want to talk a little bit about that role of literature storytelling in the Armenian community and what their function is. Because so on Story Loom, obviously we're talking about how these traditions cultivate well-being, how they promote resilience. So my questions to you are, what does storytelling mean as a process to you? And how is this festival specifically tapped into that?
So it's interesting, the framing of your question about like storytelling and what it means for Armenians and the Armenian community more broadly. And I think I do think about that a lot, but I want to take a step, sort of zoom further out first, and just talk about storytelling more broadly and like why stories matter. Really, when you and both, not, even before talking about the creation of stories or the crafting of new narratives, as someone who, um, reads literature, reads stories, or takes in stories through different forms of media, when you read a story, you're transported to a place, and you are you tap into something that you can't get through. Let me rephrase that. You tap into something that just takes you into the experience of another human and helps you connect with the experience of that other human in a way that's sometimes surprising, because you might be reading something completely fictional, futuristic, something that takes place in the deep past. You might be reading about the real life experience of someone who on the surface doesn't share much with you in their experience, but it resonates with you, you connect with it. And I don't think you can quantify what that does for helping us process, understand ourselves and our own emotions, but also connect with other people and a wider community around us. And so when I think about the importance of storytelling for Armenians, it's really, I don't think it's any different from what I just described as the importance of storytelling in general. Um, I think that as Armenians, we need to get out of this narrative of exceptionalism that it goes both ways. There's, we've all heard the things about like, oh, Armenians are the best at this and we were the first at this. And then there's the other side of Armenian exceptionalism that is rooted in our pain and our trauma. And I think it's important to understand that these are human experiences that other people can connect with and that matter not because they're Armenian. But I think we have to think about our specific experiences as individuals and as Armenian communities around the world. And I think we have to tell those specific experiences, but understand them in a wider context.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because, like, in some way, obviously, as a group, we've had very unique experiences and lived through some very specific challenges. But of course, we are all connected to like a larger human experience. And I do think Tumanyan is able to capture that. I was thinking about this the other day, actually, how as a kid growing up in the diaspora, my father would share some of Tumanyan's stories, and I remember he was like, "We're gonna read Zanki Zaranki," which is one of his folk tales, and I just remember his short stories were so engaging, and there's so much humor packed into them, and joy, and I think that's also really important. Sometimes it doesn't have to be that serious, which some people might disagree with, but I do think if we are talking about like Armenians as a group, specifically like as a group that's gone through a lot of like traumatic events, um, there is such an importance and like role for allowing ourselves to like find joy and to connect and laugh and dance and move. Um, so that actual, embodied aspect of storytelling um, is allows us to like connect with our bodies and connect to other human beings. Um, and that's all allowed and normal, and it should be um, a part of this experience for all of us. So it doesn't mean it's mutually exclusive when we're talking about serious topics, and everything has a time and a place, but it's so important to capture that positive emotion and even like silliness that we all have in us. um, so I want to move into this idea that you said that's really important, which is that these stories connect us to various cultures as well. So not only with those who have had similar experiences to us, but people who've actually had very different experiences from us. And of course, children's books allow kids to grow, develop theory of mind, empathize with someone else's experience, develop like emotional understanding and intelligence. So that actual process is really important. So I want to ask you about the structure of that festival. How did you put it together, and why did you format it in that way?
Mm-hmm. Well, you just tapped into so many things there. And before if I answer the question about specific programming that we've had in the festival, I think it is important to sort of bring to the front this aspect that you mentioned about the power of sharing stories in person with each other, sharing like just being in community with each other. And like you were saying, a lot of it is like we have dance performances and theater performances and music, and there's a lot of movement and being in that movement together in community that matters. And I think that's the aspect of the festival that um, is the thing that I feel like is the most like hopeful act of what it is that we're doing. Um, it's these 3 days where some of the people who attend are just there for a day or maybe two, but for the most part, people are present for all 3 days of the festival, and it's in this small town where you can like walk to all the different venues. Most people are attending like every single one of the performances or workshops, and when they're not, it's just like you're spending time in each other's company. And there's something about that format that it's just this experiencing the telling of like both listening to and sharing stories in this condensed period of time where you're just with this group of people, and it is a very diverse group of people who attend the festival. There's a lot of sort of people from the Yerevan and around Armenia creative community. There are quite a few diasporans who are in attendance. There are international guests, both international performers, and it is the Tumanyan International Storytelling Festival, right? And that's intentional, because we really wanted to bring our very specific stories and culture in conversation with other stories, because that's so much gets born of that, of finding commonality, but of also just like taking your imagination to places that you wouldn't otherwise expect,
Definitely.
through a completely different setting and culture. And so there are these sort of like local Armenian diaspora and international communities, in this very specific and magical setting. And um, I think the performances and workshops and the programming itself has huge value, and we put a lot of thought into how we bring that together. But it's really the fact that it all happens live in this one place with this community of people that makes it resonate. That's where I see the lasting impact, like the relationships that people form during the festival, the ideas that begin to mingle, and that later we see manifest somehow. So I think what we do is, logistically, it's a kind of hard feat, because it's a relatively remote place. Like even getting food out there, right? Like getting food for a few hundred people in this town that doesn't really have a restaurant, things like that can be challenging. But there's, and we've thrown the idea around of having other types of programming, having and we, online events and things like that, and those are all wonderful. But the yeah, the in person, uh, the act of sitting together and listening to each other and speaking to each other, and not just like sharing prepared stories, but developing ideas as you're there. I think that's really the magic of what we do there.
Yeah, it's so powerful because I think you're not only bringing people from the same experience, like you said, it's an international festival, so you're actually allowing people who grew up with very different frameworks, like culturally, mentally, and and connecting over some shared human experience that you said Tumanyan so effectively captures. So that treasure chest is actually in that the mutual adding to whatever essence the story holds. Because I feel like the story is there's like the tale, right? And how you interact with it as an individual is one thing, and it is meaningful, definitely. But then, when people come together as a group and they form relationships amongst themselves, so there's all these layers. There are layers of adding meaning to the story. Um, and I think that format that's live, just in that space, it contains so much that you can't replicate in another form. Um, so I'm curious, was there anything that you maybe expected or did not expect to happen during the festival? And this could, maybe be a challenge you had to overcome, or something that actually was pleasantly surprising. Um, and how did it play out for you?
I mean, there's so much of it, especially doing this the first year. Every aspect of it was surprising. Um, uh, Everything from, I mean, there's the organizational side of things. I should say it's this festival is like a true labor of love. It's me and my two friends, Anush Tadevosyan and Tina Yasayan, who co-founded it, and several other friends and volunteers who've helped it come together. So it's a every aspect of it, from you know thinking about the big ideas, like the kinds of things we're talking about now, But then there's the much more logistical side of it, of like, booking people and figuring out spaces and food and chairs and those things. And when something is just starting out like this, I think it's only natural that you find yourself just deeply into all of these processes. And so you go from this like really deep, meaningful discussion about how narratives can change our perspective of the future to like, wait, do we have enough forks? That kind of thing. So
Yes, both equally important.
yes. Yeah, in terms of, I should say, a big part of these bigger discussions, and part of what was exciting and interesting to me, and what is exciting and interesting to me about this festival, is like, how do we define storytelling? It's a broad term. It can mean a lot of things to different people. And when we looked at sort of storytelling festivals that take place in different parts of the world, often it's a slightly more narrow definition. It's like the style of storytelling that is very sort of contemporary is, if you're familiar with The Moth, for example, it's like this first person storytelling. You talk about something that's happened in your life, but you find a way to connect it to like have a wider resonance. And it's very sort of conversational, and there's a specific like tone and style that people think of when they think of that kind of storytelling. Um, then there is sort of more traditional oral storytelling, like what a lot of Armenians are used to, like with Osmunk, like telling these legends, either reciting them in the very, very specific way it was written, or maybe improvising a bit, but staying in this tone of sort of traditional retelling of folk tales and legends. But then there's also there's also like a marketing-y perspective of when many people, when they hear storytelling, they also think about like, how can I give in a business setting, like how can I give this pitch in a way that captures people's attention? There's like, often when people hear storytelling, they think that that's what we're talking about.
Interesting.
And which is not, it's not incorrect that when you think about that's, it's not that that's not storytelling when you're like trying to, but and then there's like, well, there's first person storytelling where you stand on a stage and you talk to people, but then storytelling also happens through several media. Storytelling can happen visually. Storytelling happens through dance, through poetry, um, through theater. And when we thought about this festival, it was like what we wanted to do was to have as broad a definition as possible of storytelling. Because the thing that led us to this was not like, we want to create a platform for a specific art form. It's like, we want to create a space where people feel comfortable and excited to share stories that feel relevant. And you don't want to limit that by a specific format. And that can be tricky in terms of creating a cohesive program. And also in communicating it, because it's like, well, is it a poetry festival? Is it a book festival? What is it? And so it can make it challenging to describe, but it also makes it really exciting and interdisciplinary. So and interactive. So we've had poetry readings, we've had theatrical performances, book talks. Definitely, we do main stage sort of like both traditional and more contemporary storytelling, just like a person standing and sharing a story. We've had workshops, like a visual storytelling workshop that Scout Tumanyan is a American Armenian photojournalist. She did this whole a really in-depth workshop, which was amazing in such a short time, but about like how to tell your story visually. And then other sort of more like hands-on arts and crafts types of workshops. And the thing that we said, when you have a broad definition, it's it can be it can be easy to get unfocused. It can be like, well, anything that's sort of like artistic. But the thing that we centered and made sort of as we were thinking about what kinds of programming to include, it's like anything that centers a narrative, anything that has a strong narrative arc and that can be expressed through any art form. So like even the musical guests that we've had perform at the, and music is such a huge part of the festival. It really brings people together. Like you might have people there who are sort of more, into like literary, and then you might have people there who are sort of there for more of the theatrical things. And there can be the one thing that connects everybody, what the local population in Tumanyan, the people who have come from different countries, regardless of what language you speak, the one thing that really connects people best is music. And it's fine to just have music because it's good music, but the musical guests we've had, like for example, Sevana Chakerian, who's a French Armenian musician and artist, she had just come back from a trip across Anatolia to different communities where she was meeting with like Laz and Hamshen and different ethnicities across Turkey, and and really sort of learning about like cultural traditions, learning their music. And she shared the music of all these different, Armenian and other ethnic groups through the stories that connect us. We had Aline from Argentina, who lives in Armenia, who sort of brings together stories from around Armenia through her music, but also from Argentina, where she's from. Shushiki Band, that who tell sort of they sing traditional Armenian folk songs, and really in a beautiful way tell the stories behind those songs. So it was like even in the musical side of things, or especially in the musical side of things, it's like what are the narrative connections that we're making through this music.
Beautiful. So, would you say that is your definition of storytelling? Like you said, anything that centers a strong narrative, or maybe there's like the motivation behind why the story is told. How would you define what storytelling is to you?
Yeah, I think storytelling, regardless of medium, is communicating an experience through narrative. That's my most simple definition.
Perfect.
And I'll complicate it a little bit. When I say narrative, I don't mean that there necessarily has to be like a a standard chronological narrative. Um, I mean, I also write poetry, and some of it is narrative poetry, but some of it is not. And I think that it I see that is storytelling too. When especially when you read a series of poems that are communicating a feeling, an idea, um, through something that is not a standard narrative. That's still there's story there. There's the impulse to communicate an experience and a feeling.
Yeah, that makes sense. It definitely makes sense. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariam Vahradyan, and you're listening to Story Loom presented by Kaitzak. So far, we've heard about the origins of the Tumanyan International Storytelling Festival, the role of narrative in Armenian cultural life, and Naidi's reflections on collective identity. Up next, we're going to dive into her podcast, Country of Dust, and the process of capturing complexity in audio storytelling. Here's a little sneak peek into one of their episodes.
Welcome to Country of Dust, Stories of a Changing Armenia. This episode, we don't talk about the future. I'm Nyree Abrahamian.
Tell me a little bit about Country of Dust, when it came about, and the relationship between the festival and the podcast, if there is one.
Yeah. So Thank you for listening, by the way. And we are hard at work on our second season as well, which will be coming out soon.
So excited.
um, there's definitely a link between the Tumanyan International Storytelling Festival and Country of Dust podcast. Um, they both were really born of the same impulse and the same, it was like a need, an urgency in this time in Armenia where we're all just trying to make sense of what's going on around us. To 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 center stories, human stories that matter. Um, and so I was throughout the 2020 war in Artsakh. So I should say that I have it's a fairly recent thing for me to be focusing sort of my professional energy on these kinds of storytelling projects. I've always been a writer. I've always felt comfortable in this mode, but my whole other career before this was in education. So I studied international education policy. I was teaching at the American University of Armenia. I was working as an educational consultant for organizations in Armenia and the diaspora to develop after school programs. And so that's been for many, many years my focus and something I still care deeply about. And I was brought to that path. So I came to Armenia in 2007 as a Birthright Armenia volunteer, and ended up staying and with a couple of detours, but for the most part, since then, I've been living in Armenia. And the thing that brought me to study education was my work here and feeling like, in different areas that I was working in tourism development and other, a few other sort of development projects years ago. And I found that every time we came across any kind of stumbling block or challenge, whether we're dealing at the government level or working in a village, it all came to education. So that's what really compelled me to study education, and have sort of focused my energy on projects that can help expand mindsets through educational programming. And there's definitely an aspect of storytelling in that as well, but that's a different conversation. So I was pretty deep in this work as an educational consultant, and when the 2020 war started, it felt really impossible to continue with business as usual, even if the business as usual was like good, impactful work. And at the time, I kind of dropped what I was doing or paused what I was doing and started working. Basically, I was like a liaison between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and international journalists who were arriving. It wasn't like any kind of official role. I just threw myself into whatever felt like it could be helpful. And it was primarily logistical, just like figuring out, these journalists are arriving and they need fixers. They need like local journalists or people to help them around. They need drivers. There's just basic things like information and accreditation. And so I was just trying to help with all of that. But like really at the heart of it, there was something deeper. And that was that being here, I was experiencing all around me these like really important human stories, things that the people that I'm with are living through. And these deserve telling. They matter. And it felt like that wasn't happening. And it was kind of like, how can I direct people towards these stories that matter? They matter to us as Armenians, but they matter as human stories that people are living through. And so that really sort of like led what I was doing. And then at the end of it, after the war ended, I think like many of us, I was left heartbroken and confused. And with this deep sense of need, of urgency to tell the stories that I think matter and to help others tell the stories that matter. I wasn't necessarily thinking of it in terms of like, this is oral history, this matters for archiving, but like that's there too, you know? And so it was kind of this moment of like, what can we do in this moment that firstly for me, it's something that feels true to me. Like I think in these moments of crisis, you think you just gravitate towards the thing that feels the most true to who you are and what you can offer. So it was in this sort of like aftermath moment that both the festival and the podcast were born. And both are projects that I've done in collaboration with, that I've like co-created with really amazing friends. So for the podcast, it was, you know, a group of us, couple of us here in Armenia, a couple in the diaspora who were thinking there was just like a Zoom call of like, how are you? How's everyone doing? And what can we do? And among that group of friends was my amazing co-producer, Jeremy Dalmas, who I'd met years ago when he was here in Armenia as a Birthright volunteer. And he's, you know, a career podcast producer and sound engineer. And so partly it was like this, similar to the festival. With the festival, it was like we're feeling this need. And there's this place, Tumanyan, that feels like the right setting to make this happen. With the podcast, it was like, here's a group of people. We have this, we have an idea of what we want to put out into the world. I'd never made a podcast before, but you know, this is like Jeremy's main mode. It's his career, and he's amazing at it. Also, Gohar Khachatarian, our other co-producer, who is she's an amazing human, and she is the half of Armenia's first feminist podcast that was out for several years, called Agancho. And so we had this instinct and we had this set of expertise. And there were actually several iterations, or like one main iteration of what we thought this podcast might be before it turned into what it is now. So what it is now is narrative storytelling. So our super short pitch for it is, if anyone is familiar with This American Life, it's This Armenian Life. So it's this style of storytelling in that it's not just an interview, right? It's not just like two people, like what we're doing right now, which is a very common format for podcasts. And it's wonderful in that you can, you know, you have the conversation, you might do a little bit of editing and you get it out. What we are doing with Country of Dust is they're audio documentaries. So each episode has, what goes into each episode is hours and hours of interviews, in some cases over the course of a year, where I guess we should start with like, what leads us to the idea of an episode, or what leads us to think about the themes for our season. So it's really like, there are all of these big events and shifts happening in Armenia, and you know, we're here living through it and trying to make sense of it. And so how can we open up these stories, these things that might just feel like, you know, news items? How can we bring about a more nuanced understanding of what this all means through a person's story, through how they're living through it? And so for our first season, it was pretty clearly led by that. It was like, there's the war and its aftermath. There was the blockade in Artsakh. So for that episode, we had Ashot's story over the course of, we didn't even know what the episode was going to be when we first started talking about it. We just knew that it was about, at the time, in this period after the war and before the complete ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, it was this period of deep uncertainty. And so it was like, how can we communicate that uncertainty through the life of somebody who's there living through it? And it was interesting because at any given moment, what we thought was going to be the focus of the episode would shift. So like at one point it was, you know, there was a checkpoint that Azerbaijan put in that you had to like pass to get to Stepanakert. And we thought like, at the time, it felt like such big news. It felt like that checkpoint is the thing, but then things kept shifting and moving and getting more intense. And so even just working on that as an episode, like when you're thinking about this kind of like story-based podcast, you have, even when you go into your first interview, you have a real sense of the arc that you want to get out of the story. And of course that shifts as you talk to the person. But in this case, it was especially challenging, and that kind of became the story of how it kept moving. So we spoke to Ashot first when we were still able to go to Artsakh, and then and we spoke to him again during the blockade online, and then so it was like this constant shifting of the situation. So in any case, so there's the interviews and then we take however many hours of audio we have, and we isolate just like sound bites that we think will go into the episode. So a person might tell within, let's say, a 3-hour interview, there might be like 10 different ways or more, but like I'll narrow it down to 10 different episodes that can be created out of this, right? And then it's like, well, what 1, 2, or 3 of these threads are we going to pull together? Even if all these other things were also interesting, what is the narrative arc we're going to create? What's the story we're going to tell with this? And then we isolate that, we figure that out, we discuss it among ourselves, and then we draft the script of the narrator. So each episode has one of the 3 of us as the narrator, and then it's like, well, we have these audio clips. So what are the things that we as the narrator can say to emphasize or clarify, or like how, to make the story cohesive. And then we have several versions of that, several read-throughs. Then we record the narrator, and then Jeremy engineers it all together. So it's essentially, it's like a video. It's like when you watch a documentary, except it doesn't have the video element. It's all audio. There's a lot that goes into it. Our initial idea for the podcast was not necessarily this. We had the idea to do like if anyone is familiar with StoryCorps, so it's a US-based like audio documentary project and podcast that basically they just have these recording booths where 2 people who know each other can go in, and like one person interviews the other. So it might be like, a mother and daughter, or best friends, or like coworkers, and they just have a conversation. And the conversation might go on for an hour or more, and that gets like stored in an archive. But of the thousands and thousands of conversations that they facilitate, that they record, they'll pick a few for each episode and bring it down to like 5 minutes of audio. So bring out this tiny little story that, again, it's like very specific in its details, but has universal resonance. So that was our initial idea, to do that kind of thing. But then we found as we were going and we were doing trials of this, that it was like, there's so much, there's so many layers, so much nuance in these and stories that might not come out, or like somebody might tell it in a very convincing way when you're having coffee with them. They'll just like be talking about what happened to them, like, this is what it, during the war, I couldn't get a hold of my sister, and whatever the story is, it might be very compelling when just in a regular conversation, but the moment the recorder goes on, that can shift. And we feel that even with ourselves, So in any case, we just found that like what we wanted to do with the podcast had a wider scope than we realized, than what we initially envisioned. And I, having never made a podcast before, didn't realize how much work goes into doing the kind of thing that we're doing. So I was like, yes, of course, this is how I could just hear the end product. Jeremy did know, but was fortunately just very enthusiastic and positive and didn't dissuade us. And so that's what we do.
No, that's so amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that. And you brought up this word, and it kept popping up in my head as well when you were talking. And the word is nuance. So I think your podcast, Country of Dust, is so nuanced and complex. It's such a complex way of storytelling. not, or in addition to, how you've put it together, which I can only imagine, like how much work goes into it, how many iterations you guys have to go through, but also like the nuance that exists in the stories, in the people. Um, I think unfortunately we do live in times where people have become, um, things aren't clear. It's uncertain times. So people, I think, collapse into that black and white thinking. They want to know exactly what this or that means. But I think that nuance is so needed and people can really connect with it. So, hearing that someone's going through a similar experience or is just trying to navigate what is happening in their lives, I feel like that's so healing. It's validating, um, and it's a way to connect. That you can't get that watching the news. It doesn't give us that same portal to do that. So and it can actually make us feel worse. Anyone living on planet Earth right now probably feels that being bombarded, but not actually being able to relate to people's day-to-day experiences. So hearing what people are experiencing from their point of view, hearing their words that you interview in Country of Dust, I think that these people really embody resilience, perseverance, and the ability to somehow keep going in very sometimes dire circumstances, which is incredibly challenging. So I commend you guys on that. It's not an easy task, but it is so essential to hear these stories of people who, their stories aren't always told, or they're not told in the way that they should be. They're not accurate. And so it's so powerful what you've done. I think another thing that's important here, which I'd love to hear your take on, is I think maybe as an ethnic group, we're also not always sure who's telling our story. So you are actually giving people the platform to reflect and to use their own words to control this narrative. Um, and as one of the narrators yourself, you're sharing that experience of what it's like to interview, and talking about one of the episodes, which I think is episode 3, if I'm not mistaken, where you're talking, um, uh, you're interviewing someone, and you discuss how you were supposed to go back to Artsakh and then to continue the interviews. And when you check Twitter and you see that you're actually not able to go. Um, so, what does that mean for you as a narrator and as a person? It's not really just about the interview, but you actually have this lived experience um, as an individual who's sort of moving through these events yourself. So, I want to ask you about your next steps for the podcast, and you alluded to it a little bit, but I think people would be interested to hear about if you're shifting anything or what your focus is going to be. If you're allowed to give us a little sneak peek.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share a sneak peek. And first, I just want to address what you were saying before about like the perspectives that we bring in as narrators. And that's something that we think a lot about as well. And between me and Gohar and Jeremy, we each have different, I mean, we're different people, obviously, but we have different backgrounds in our relationship to Armenia and Armenianness. So, Gohar was born and raised here. And was born in Soviet Armenia, lived through the collapse and the building of independent Armenia, and her whole life has been. It's not just that she lives here; like so much of how her life has developed is based on how things in her lifetime, the tumultuous time that Armenia has lived through. And so I was born in Toronto to Armenian parents from Lebanon, with roots in Western Armenia. But I grew up in like a very sort of in some ways, traditional diasporan household. I grew up speaking Armenian. I went to like an Armenian after school program. It was a big part of my identity. And Jeremy was born in San Francisco, and his one parent is Armenian. And it wasn't necessarily like a big part of the way he grew up. He didn't grow up speaking the language. Then he came here as a young adult with Birthright Armenia and sort of developed his own connection and curiosity with this place. And now with the podcast, he travels back and forth a lot. He kind of like lives in both places. But even when he's not here, he really feels connected to this place in a way that it's interesting, because it's like maybe the people around him, like he was saying the other day, when difficult things are happening here, like throughout the blockade in Artsakh, for example, it was challenging because he was following everything here. He was checking in. His mind and heart were here, but the people around him don't even know what's going on. The people around him in San Francisco. So in any case, we each have our different relationships to Armenia as a place, and like our relationship with it. And so, yeah, I think that we bring that in. We try, and it's with the stories that we're sharing. It absolutely is like we write together. So all three of our perspectives are brought into the writing. And we do think a lot about like, whose story are we sharing? And in what case is bringing our own experience and our own perspective helpful, beneficial? Where does it add complexity? And like, where is it not needed? So that is something we think about a lot. And then to your question about season 2, which, so yeah, we have 8 episodes in the works. We are working really hard on them, and they will be out like later in the spring. And with the first season, I sort of described this, for me, it was living through that particular moment in Armenia a few years back. It was like every moment I felt like I had to just, when people would ask me, like friends in the diaspora would ask me like, what's life like there now? It would be hard to answer, because I just felt like I needed to be like paying attention. Like every moment I was like on edge, like trying to figure out what's going on. And it came out of that. So it's like, how do we open up all of these shifts? And with this season, maybe it's like both for the three of us, having lived through those years and thinking back to like the past year or more here, it's been less about like constant shifts and uncertainty, and it's been more about like, how do we make sense of the moment that we're in? It's been more sort of contemplative. And I think that carries into the kinds of episodes that we're doing. So we've never been like a breaking news podcast, but I would say if the first season was more about like, this is the thing in the news, and here's like a story that helps you understand it. It's still about things that are relevant in Armenia now. But it's like almost, it veers more towards the contemplative. And in terms of themes, I would say we're thinking a lot about like what it means to be of a place. What do borders signify? And I can give you a sense of some of the episodes. So we have in our first season, actually, it was like an add-on episode that we did in October of 2023. It was like just as the exodus, as the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh was taking place. We spoke to Gayane like literally 24 hours after she and her family had been forced to flee. And we have another episode coming up with Gayane, but speaking to her sort of after a year of being a refugee in Armenia. I think that these kinds of stories, there's the initial shock value of and not, and it's incredibly important to record and document this too, but like in those days when you just had like, the images of all of the cars leaving Artsakh with all of the things packed on them and all of people arriving with, a bag of their belongings. And that's something that, we're still trying to process. But then what happens to the person after they're here, after a month, after 2 months, after several months? And I think that in many people's imaginations, it's kind of like, oh, well, they're Armenians and they're in Armenia. But they're still displaced, and they're still struggling with a lot, and they're still persevering through a lot. And so Gayana's story in particular, she and her two kids have had to move around Armenia several times, just trying to find a way to make it work. And she has grown a lot through the process. And so she shares a lot her thoughts about sort of like what this year has been for her, but also her relationship with Artsakh as her homeland, and it's complicated. That's one of the stories that we have this season. Another thing this season is a first for us is we have 2 episodes about, it's my family's story and my ancestral homeland of Musa Ler, where I still have family living in our indigenous land. And it's a region that, so in 2023, in Turkey, there was a huge earthquake that, Musa Ler and the Armenian community there has been really badly affected by that too. But the story that the 2 episodes that we're doing about Musa Ler are, they actually span like 5 generations of my family's story.
Wow.
And the relationship that I have with the place, the relationship my father had with the place, actually finding the home that my great grandfather built there. And so, yeah, there are many layers there, but it's those episodes are what I'm working on right now, what we're working on right now. And they're especially challenging to work on for a few reasons. Of course, it's like, when you're sharing something that is your own personal story, it can be, it's vulnerable, which helps me really appreciate like what we ask of our guests. But beyond that side of it, which I am quite comfortable with, beyond that side of it, it's, I was describing before what it's like to put together an episode where you have hours and hours of your interview, and then somehow we distill that down to like a 20 or 30-minute episode. But in this case, it's not just the hours and hours of interviews that we have, it's like all of the knowledge that I have of several generations of my family story and that place and why it matters, and distilling that down, and being kind of not ruthless is not the right word, but being like, what in this case, what is in service of the story that we're telling? And that means like, so instead of just, taking 8 hours of tape and singling out bits of audio, it's like, how do I distill down like everything that I'm carrying inside me about the place that is my place of origin and what it means? So that's a big challenge. And actually, we do have 2 other episodes this season that take place in Turkey. The other 2 are in Istanbul, or like have to do with a place in Istanbul where we went. And they have to do with the community of migrants who have gone from Armenia, from the Republic of Armenia, to work in Turkey. And it centers around a school called the Hrant Dink School that actually serves the children of these migrants and prepares them to move back to Armenia.
Wow. Yeah. So many important topics. And I really truly cannot wait. Wow. Yes, so many important topics. And I truly can't wait. I will be in the first queue of listeners. And yeah, thanks for sharing about that. Your family's history and your openness and your vulnerability, and the difficulty of feeling like you're doing justice and telling your family story, and then at the end having to decide, well, which which story am I going to tell, and actually which ones are not going to make the cut in the podcast. Of course, it sort of also is challenging because it's like, you know, they're not going to make it out into the world because you've gathered all of it and now it can't be shared. So that would be, yeah, I can imagine that would be challenging.
The what it's really important, and I really value having like the friends and co-producers that I have, um, because they're able to like both be considerate and gentle with me, but and also like I trust I trust their vision and I trust their judgments, and so we're really able to have this relationship where we're it's not just with this story, but I'm especially feeling it with this story, where we're able to support each other. And you can have working relationships where it's like everybody is just being nice and nobody wants to step on each other's toes, and then you can have on the other extreme, it's just like brutal honesty.
Ruthless,
um,
yeah.
yeah, and I think that what we have is like we're really rigorous. We really challenge each other, and we do it with kindness. And I'm very grateful for that.
That's beautiful, Naidi. Thanks so much. And it's so important to have relationships like that, both in and outside of work, obviously, to have people you can cherish and feel safe with. So, um, yeah, I'm so moved by our conversation, your level of intention and meaning that you bring to your work. It sounds like you're really able to channel your lived experience, process it, and in a way that gives back and adds something, to the community and to the world at large. Um, and I really appreciate that you challenge certain narratives that lack nuance or silence people, even, don't allow people to share their stories in a way that's accurate. So, um, of course, do what you do takes a lot of time, and maybe it's uncertain sometimes, like what it's going to turn out to be. But I do think bold, important ideas initially, it's not always clear like where you're headed. But I commend you and the people that you've been working with, because it really does sound like you guys have such a in fruitful dynamic, and it's exciting to hear that as a fellow listener of the podcast, that you have that dynamic. So just thanks again for talking to me today, for sharing all of your experiences in Armenia, the work that's been so important to unpack, the importance of storytelling at large for Armenians, and for the world in general, how you've added to it, developed it further in a way that's relevant to what people are trying to make sense of today, and the challenges they face, as well as the celebrations when they occur. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you for the work that you're doing as well. And it's really exciting to have you in this space in the sort of shared project that we have going. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Story Loom, a podcast created and hosted by me, Mariam Vahradyan, and produced by Andre Vatan. Here, we explore ancient cultural traditions and how they promote well-being in our communities. If you have a cultural tradition that's impacted your community, reach out to us on Kaitzak. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon on Story Loom.